Okay, so what is, the first thing I want to talk about is just basically what is digital photography, and we're going to have a couple of these conversations early in this class. You know, what is digital photography? What is a digital image? You know, how does this all work? The very basics of it. And I like to start, even though some of you have never used film, and you just kind of grew up digital. I like to talk about digital photography still in context of film photography and kind of the differences, and I think that helps build a better understanding. In fact, I'm kind of a firm believer in if you want to be a photographer, you really should take a film class. Myself, I think that there are things that you learn shooting manual film that are more difficult to pick up when you're just shooting digitally all the time. So if you haven't yet, take the Intro to Photography class. So analog photography, this is our traditional photography, what I call analog photography. The image is actually recorded on film. There's light-sensitive chemistry on the film, an emulsion. The film is exposed by light, and then we develop that image. We pull that image, the latent image, with chemistry. One of the big differences that we see still between traditional photography, film photography, and digital photography is this idea here of continuous tone versus digital steps. In traditional photography, continuous tone is possible, which means that we have this incredibly fine gradation, you know, from completely dark to completely light. We actually have a very smooth transition from one side to the other. And what I want you guys to understand is that in digital, while we have improved the technology continually, and it's incredible what we can do with it now, we actually will never be able to have continuous tone. In digital photography, instead of film behind the lens, we have a sensor. The sensor records levels of light, and then it's going to, with your camera is basically a little computer, with the processor, the computer inside the camera, it's going to write code that describes the light that it sees. So believe it or not, you know, what comes out the other end is these beautiful images. But what we're creating with our digital cameras is a series of ones and zeros. It's all computer programming. It comes down to math even, okay? Because digital photography is based on what we can call pixels, digital photography, we will never really have continuous tone. We will have discrete steps. Because if you zoom in at the very fine information in a digital image, you're going to find basically a bunch of small rectangles. That's what a pixel is, a little rectangle. So regardless of how much we improve digital photography, this is really always going to be the case. Now this was more of an issue when I started teaching. I've been teaching this class for like 8 years now, and when I started teaching this class, a high-end digital camera would capture somewhere between 3 and 5 megapixels. And now a high-end digital camera shoots upward of 20 in some cases, and there are digital cameras that you can get that they have sensors that will capture 50 megapixels in some cases. So, but the technology is improving, and the reality is what we see at this point is that most people really can't see that difference in quality anyway. The difference between a high-quality digital image and a film image. If you put a film image and a digital image in front of them, they're not going to be able to tell you this one's the film image, this one's the digital image, unless they have a pretty trained eye. Okay?
And so the reason why you can't have continuous tones is because it's all those little rectangles?
Because the image is actually made up of little tiny rectangles. Okay? So that's why we can't have continuous tone. Because, by definition, the image is a bunch of little tiny rectangles. Okay? So to help you out, hopefully, with the analogy here, the continuous tone versus digital steps, and I don't know that everyone had this experience. When I was in junior high school, I took a drawing class, and in the drawing class, the art instructor gave me a sheet of paper and said, I want you to, with your 4B pencil, or 6B, your soft lead pencil, I want you to create an area that is as dark as you possibly can make it over here on the left, and then I want you to gradually make the tone lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter until it appears white. So this very gradual gradation. And it would look something like we have, this is a visual representation at the bottom, and the irony here is, of course, that's digital. So it can't actually be continuous tone. But it would have that appearance, that gradual appearance. Then the instructor would give us another piece of paper with a series of boxes in it and ask us to do the same thing, but kind of have us do it in steps. In this box, I want it to be 100% completely black. On this box on the right, I want it to be completely white, no darkness at all, and then everywhere in between you create little steps. And I think that's a pretty good analogy for what we're talking about versus, continual tone versus digital steps. Is that with digital steps, we are going to have these little boxes. And if you look really close at a digital image, you're going to be able to see those little boxes. Now, like I said, the cameras have gotten so good that most people can't actually see that, but it is still a consideration. And depending on your sensor, the quality may not be quite as good as you want, and you will actually see some of that more often than in some nicer cameras. I also want to talk about some basic camera anatomy and functionality. One of the first things I'm going to ask you to do in this class is to try to get to know your digital camera. And I don't have requirements as to what type of digital camera you have for this class. And I know that we have people with varying levels of camera. Some of them are consumer level cameras, and some of you have professional level cameras. And that's fine. Whatever your camera is, I want you to get to know that camera. And I want you to learn about your camera settings so that you can do more with that camera. And I think that in most cases you're going to find that your camera does more than you think it does. A few of the settings that I want you to pay attention to are going to have to do with exposure. Exposure meaning the amount of light that was needed for a particular photograph to be captured. Three things that we use with our cameras to create an appropriate exposure are the ISO of our sensor, in this case, the shutter speed of our camera, and the aperture of our lens. Okay? The first thing I want to talk about is the ISO. Now, our sensor, it says sensor sensitivity. There's a couple of ways that our sensor is sensitive. Our sensor, we can actually make it more or less sensitive to light. And for those of you who have film experience, it's the same set of numbers that we use for film. If you purchase film and you're going to shoot outdoor photography, you might shoot a 100 speed ISO film. This is a film that is not as sensitive, but you don't need film to be terribly sensitive if you're shooting outside. As you have less light, you shoot a more sensitive film that has a higher number. A 400 would be like a standard indoor film. If you were shooting something at night or low light, you might shoot a 1600. It's actually really tough to get anything other than 100 and 400 right now, though, as far as speeds of film. They use the same measurement for our sensors. Our sensors have a sensitivity that we also relate to this number, this ISO. So, and some of the standard or typical settings that we see are 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600. Depending on your camera, you may have a far wider range than that. You may also have steps in between those. Those are what we call standard stops, full stops. And for this class, you're not going to have to understand stops. And don't worry, Jolene, we won't be doing any reciprocity charts in here. Yeah. Well, maybe I'll make an exception just for Jolene. I'll make her do reciprocity charts. But a stop, for those of you who are not familiar with it, who have not taken the Introduction to Photography class, is a doubling or halving of light. So for instance, a 100 speed sensitivity is half as fast as a 200. So it needs twice as much light as 200. Okay? Now, this is not a setting that you guys are probably going to spend a lot of time with, but I do want you to be aware of it. Because particularly for those of you who have higher end cameras, you're going to have an easier control on that. Some of you have what most of us consider just basically a point and click camera, and it's actually going to be tough for you guys to get into your ISO on those cameras. But again, so when you do find this in your owner's manual, that's what that means. One of the reasons why we really need to understand the basics. I'm sorry. This is a really funny story. She asked what ISO stands for, and I love telling this story. You have no idea what you've just done. You just got me on a tangent. Let me take a drink before I answer this. ISO, it's a really funny thing. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, because that's the name of the organization that creates standards, and in particular created that standard. There used to be two other types of film speed, DIN and ASA, and you guys don't need to know this at all. And they were two different sets of numbers, and it was really confusing, and so they combined it all together and created ISO. So, really let down right now. I'm sorry. Yeah, ISO stands for International Standards Organization. So can you give me a definition of what ISO is? ISO is the sensitivity, how sensitive your sensor is to light.
Thank you.
Now, why we need to explore the settings of our camera and know our cameras better than we do is because it makes certain types of photography possible. If you never take your camera off of the automatic setting, certain types of photography are just not, they're completely not available to you. It won't happen. It cannot happen. The couple examples that I have here are low light and then high speed photography. Not terribly high speed. In fact, I happen to know that the shutter speed on that was only 160, which is kind of slow, and the basketball's blurred. And I only know that because that's my photograph of my daughter that I took at a basketball game. But understanding our camera settings, we can create images more easily, more accurately, better images. We can do things like speed up our shutter speed and freeze motion, as opposed to wondering why, damn it, why is everything blurry in these images? We can take a photograph of a jack-o'-lantern and get this reverse image, get the image of the light inside of the jack-o'-lantern, instead of getting the flash popping on the jack-o'-lantern, because that's what's going to happen if you use the automatic setting. The camera's going to say, I don't have enough light, pop flash. Okay? So there are certain types of images that you're not going to be able to create unless you get off of the automatic settings on your camera. So that's why this is important. Shutter speed. Shutter is one of the more important parts of the camera. It's one of the features that you really should be looking for when you're purchasing a camera, investing in a camera, I should say. The shutter is what is going to expose the sensor to light. It is an apparatus that is positioned in front of the sensor. Now this shutter actually, there's a number of different apparatus that your camera may actually have. In an old film camera, it would be a combination of a mirror that sits in front of the film, and in a DSLR, that's what we still have. In the film camera, you'd also have a set of like silk barn doors behind that, and they flash open for whatever time is required for your camera's settings automatically, or whatever you tell it. So the little mirror flips up, the little barn doors behind open up, and it exposes the sensor. The amount of time that is open is going to help us with a number of things. One, we need enough light to get the image. In lower light, we need a longer amount of time to get the image. In more light, it can be a very quick amount of time. The things that we can do creatively are really important as well. If we want to shoot fast speed and freeze motion, if we're like shooting a sporting event, we want to have a fast shutter speed that will actually freeze that motion. If we want to do something like painting with light, which is a really fun application of slow shutter speed, you can open the shutter speed with low light for an extended period of time and then actually draw something with light in front of your camera. This is something that a lot of students like to do when we get to the shutter speed assignment, when we use the slow shutter speed. And it's a lot of fun, yes.
I just have a really cool example of that. My friend Heidi and I both have pretty fun cameras. And we had some glow sticks and we're playing in our bedroom in the dark with the glow sticks spinning them around. And so she put her camera on a tripod and left the shutter speed open like 30 seconds or a minute or something. And we just went in front of the camera and spun the glow sticks around. And then that picture was this really cool, like, tracking motion of
You can do a number of things. When we talk about painting with light, you can actually like take a light source and put it in front of the camera. You can draw something in the air that is then captured by the camera. You can illuminate something. I had a couple of students last semester that did a really fantastic job. One student had a colored light, and she put her guitar in front of the camera, opened the shutter for like 30 seconds, and then ran her light around the guitar, so she illuminated the guitar, which is a lot of fun. And that's a kind of a traditional light painting. You can do that with like a scene. There are a lot of photographers who will like do the ones I always see are that like people take classic cars and they'll turn their camera on 30-second shutter speed and they'll walk around the car with a flash and pop the flash at the car, and it creates this really interesting lighting effect. And then another student had this little Buddha statue, and he had 3 different colors of lights, and he hit the shutter, opened the shutter and it was again a 30-second exposure, illuminated the Buddha with a red light, moved the Buddha, illuminated the Buddha with a green light, moved the Buddha again, and then illuminated the Buddha with a blue light. So there were 3 different colored Buddhas. It was the same one, and then you could see him moving the light as well. You can do all kinds of fun stuff, like, several years ago I was teaching my son. I said, well, we were talking about, I'm one of these skeptical people. Like, I think that it's really silly that, and I apologize if I'm offending anyone when I say this. I don't believe in time travel, ghosts, Sasquatch, El Chupacabra, or anything else. I think that's all silly. And my son was talking about, well, people have gotten photographs of ghosts. And I was, well, I can get a photograph of a ghost right now. Do you want to do that? And he thought it was really strange. And so I set my camera up on a tripod, set my shutter speed to 30 seconds, told him to stand in front of the camera and make an angry face, hit the shutter, and after 15 seconds I told him to get out of the way. And it's this kind of transparent image of him making an angry face at the photograph, but then because he got out of the way for the last 15 seconds, you can see what was behind him. And he thought that was kind of cool. So I proved that he was a ghost. He's not actually living. Now he thinks he's a ghost. He goes around trying to scare people all the time. No, that doesn't happen. He's a very serious kid, way too serious for my liking. Okay, so there's all kinds of really great things we can do creatively with the shutter. We need to understand how to use our shutter. Now, some of you are not going to have a manual feature on your camera, or what we call shutter priority. And if you don't know what shutter priority is, we'll talk about that at some point as well. But you will have other modes on your camera called scene modes that are helpful to you, that give you the opportunity to kind of cheat these things. Like, how many of you guys have a camera with the little guy on the camera who looks like he's doing this, except for he's much more slender than I am? Okay, that's what's called the sports mode. And that is what I call, it's a shutter speed priority like variation. Essentially, when you put your camera on the little runny guy mode, you're telling the camera, I want to speed up my shutter speed. And so the camera shoots with a higher shutter speed. It's faster, okay? If you, let's see, how many of you guys have like a night or a night cityscape mode on your camera? Okay, that would be an extended shutter speed. And there's actually variations of that. There's night and night portrait, and those are really fun. I love that they have that because it gives me an opportunity to talk about shutter drag. So night would be a setting where your shutter speed's going to open, your shutter's going to open for a longer period of time. Night portrait is probably going to be your shutter's going to open and your flash is going to fire, which is lots of fun. But what happens when your camera does that is that the flash exposes what's in the foreground, so you get a nice crisp portrait. But then after that, the shutter stays open. So what is behind your subject will continue to be exposed. How many of you guys have taken a photograph at night and the flash pops and all you get is the person in the foreground? Or if you take a photograph and the shutter stays open for a long time but the flash doesn't pop, then everything's blurry. Okay, well what I just talked about, that's how you solve that problem. You open your shutter for a long period of time and pop the flash. So, and that's how you get those really cool. How many of you guys have seen the really neat wedding portrait where the bride and the groom are standing in front of the trees and it's at dusk and there's this beautiful sunset? That shot, that's flash photography. The shutter is open for a longer period of time to get those beautiful colors of the sunset, but the bride and the groom were exposed with a flash. With a strobe, excuse me. Some photographers would get really angry at me if they heard me say flash. So it's a strobe.
So when they're standing there, the people, do you move the people?
You don't have to. The strobe is going to expose them properly and they will be crisp. And it's the amount of light that you're going to get off of them after that is not going to affect the exposure or the image very much. Now it's possible that you can get some ghosting where you get kind of a double image, but it's if they stand fairly still, it's not a problem.
So what's happening is you're getting the image of the people from the flash,
and then the shutter drags and stays open to get the sunset, the illumination behind it. So you can do that manually if you have a camera that allows you to do it, or you can use those really cool scene modes that will help you do that as well. All of those scene modes have some sort of correlation to this. It's a way that people who don't understand how to do it manually can create those images. But you have to understand them to really be able to manipulate them. Otherwise you're like, what the heck does that mean? All right. So I think I will continue to talk about shutter in additional classes. And then there's also a video online you guys can watch as well. And I think on that one I have really groovy music. And it's not copyright infringement at all. All right. The other thing that we are going to use to control the... I didn't use my camera to demonstrate shutter. I have props and I forget. All right, moving on. The other thing that we have that controls the amount of light that hits the sensor is the aperture. And the aperture actually exists in the lens. The aperture is the opening of the lens, the size of the opening of the lens. And I'm going to pass this around so you guys can see it. But you can actually, with this lens, you can spin the aperture and you can see it opening and closing. So I'm sure you've seen that before, Chuck. Now, again, we can do multiple things with the aperture. Just like with the shutter speed. With the shutter speed, we can control the exposure, the amount of light that comes in, and we do things creatively. Same thing with the aperture. With the aperture, we can, of course, if the opening is wider, more light comes in. If the opening is narrower, less light comes in. Now, creatively, what's going to happen with this is we can control what is called depth of field. This is one of the things that helps us control depth of field. Depth of field is the area that is in acceptable focus around your subject. So if I'm taking a portrait of Chuck and he is my focal plane, there's going to be an area in front of Chuck and an area behind of Chuck that may be an acceptable focus. I can manipulate that. Because it's a portrait shot of Chuck, I don't want distractions. So I probably want to compress my depth of field to make it shallower. Aperture is one of the things I can use to control that. If an aperture is wider, if the opening is wider, we will have a shallower depth of field. If the aperture is narrower, we will have greater depth of field. And one of the tricky things with aperture is that the numbers are goofy. Aperture is a ratio, which means that the numbers don't get bigger as the aperture opens. The numbers get smaller. A 2.8 is a bigger opening than a 22. Okay? So as you're learning to mess with your camera, that's going to be one of those weird things that doesn't make sense right away. But you'll have to, and you just kind of just have to remember. One of the ways that I like to remember how depth of field is affected by aperture is Ansel Adams, because most people know who Ansel Adams is. Ansel Adams took landscape photographs. So with a landscape photograph, do you want to have a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field? Okay, generally speaking. Give me a generalization. Deeper, you mean? Okay, yes, I would agree that for most landscape photography, you want a very deep depth of field. So one of the ways that I remember this is that Ansel Adams was part of a group of photographers that called themselves F64, which was a very, very tiny aperture. Okay, and they shot with a small aperture because they wanted the greatest amount of detail. They wanted to create very crisp images. Okay, so that's one of the ways I remember. And I have another slide here that talks about depth of field.
You say deeper and then you say narrow, or deeper,
deeper, narrower.
But the narrower aperture gives you a
deeper depth of field. Yeah, I know, and that's a tricky one at first. That's a tricky one. Again,
the way I used it is the same thing with wire. If you got household wire, the larger
gauges.
Smaller, the wire.
Yeah.
Same with jewelry and stuff.
Jewelry.
Yeah. Well, and it's not quite the same thing, and I don't know how if it correlates with gauges, because with aperture, it's actually the opening of the lens, and I don't know the math behind this, so don't ask me what the equation is. But the ratio actually refers to the opening the lens to the length of the lens. And how many of you guys have like a zoom lens? Okay, and how many of you have been frustrated because you understand what aperture is, and as you zoom, your aperture changes? Okay, that's because it's a ratio. There are some lenses, and I call them more accessible lenses. I won't call them cheap lenses. I'll call them accessible lenses. That when you zoom out, your aperture rating is actually smaller because you've now extended the lens, so the ratio is different. And lenses that don't do that, there are actually zoom lenses that you can purchase that are fixed aperture. They're more expensive. They're pricey. So, all right. So again, this is about aperture, how aperture affects depth of field here, and of course you guys can read that because I kind of talked about it already. But at the bottom there it says, beyond aperture there are two other things that we can use to control the depth of field. And I thought I'd ask who can tell me. And somebody in here should be able to tell me. Because at least three of you were in intro with me last semester. What are the other two things that we can affect our depth of field with?
The length of the light.
Yes, Allie, thank you. Yes, okay. So aperture is one of the things. The focal length of the lens affects the depth of field. If we have a longer focal length, it will produce a shallower depth of field. A shorter focal length will produce a deeper depth of field. What else? One more thing. And the reason why I talk about these is because some of you do not have cameras that are going to give you a lot of control over your aperture. So these are the two things you're going to use. You're going to use your focal length and... distance from subject? Yes! Thank you, Dan. Your distance from subject. If you are closer to your subject, you will produce a shallower depth of field. If you are further from your subject, you will produce a deeper depth of field. So how close the camera is to the focal plane. So if you have a camera that's a more accessible camera, and you do not have manual or aperture priority mode on your camera, and you're worried about how you're going to manipulate the depth of field, you're going to use the optical zoom on your camera and your feet. Okay? That's how you're going to do that. You're going to walk back and forth and you're going to zoom in and out. Even if you have control of your aperture, you may not have a wide range of apertures on your camera. All right? Hey, you guys remembered. I'm so happy. Yes?
Why is it called the
It's still called an f-stop. I just don't like using the term f-stop. Because, and there again, this is another one of those things that other photographers would like throw things at me if they heard me say that. And the reason why I don't like to say f-stop is because I find it, for people who are new to photography, I think it sounds daunting and confusing. And an f-stop is not the only stop. We have stops in Aperture, we have stops in our ISO, our sensitivity, and we have stops in shutter speed. Because a stop is what? A halving or doubling of light. So it's anything that we do with our camera that makes the camera more or less sensitive or allows more or less light into it. So I don't know, I'm not one of those, I gotta say f-stop all the time. F-stop just means it's a stop of aperture. So, yes?
Yes, let me see if I understand this right. The larger the number on the aperture, the deeper the focus, because the smaller the hole's going to be.
Yes. Yes. Did everyone get that? Ask questions. Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that because we're not going to have a shooting assignment right away. Your first assignment with your camera is to read your manual. I want you to find your manual and read your manual. Okay? This is important. You have to know your camera. Okay? And it's...
Buy Daniel's time to read my manual.
What? That's terrible. You can't buy someone's time. You can't get someone else to read your manual for you. Well, I suppose you... Okay. I suppose you can. I guess the correct thing for me to say is that you shouldn't. Yeah. And it's and let's talk about
He said,
what?
You still have to learn it.
Yeah. I would have said you can't afford me. Yes, Chantel. There's this. Oh, you stole my thunder. I was going to say this. I have this line that I like to use. There's this really great thing. It's called the internet, and everybody's using it, and you can get your manual online. And I remembered her name. Did you guys get that?
Good job.
All right.
Let's do a quick name.
That's, oh, God. I got to do everybody?
Let's do it.
Yeah, do it. Come on, let's hear it.
All right. I don't know if I can do this. All right. Cassie, Allie, Zach, Chantel, Jolene, Mandy, Renee, Trina, John, Mike, Chuck, Stephanie. Right? Okay. Not Janice? I'm just messing with you. That's all right. Jamie, Dan. Hold on. No, I got this. Because you guys moved. And I don't think it mattered. Okay. See what you guys did to me? Okay, now I'm going to use the cheat sheet now. Because I knew this. Sarah. No? Sarah? Okay. Sarah. And, no, it's all right. It's not your fault. I'm just making excuses because I like to do that. Which makes you somebody on this list somewhere.
Starts with an A.
Ashley. Thank you, Jamie. Oh. Man, I need a break now. You guys are working me hard.
Now, we don't have to sit here in the same place all the time, do we?
No, you don't. I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out.
Future classes will always remember your names.
We'll be sure to switch it up.
Yes. Yeah. Once I get your name, well, actually, that's not true. There was a period of time last year I kept on calling the editors by the other, like Sean and Will. I was like, I kept on calling Will Sean and Sean Will. And I had known them for like a year and a half. So I'm just bad at this. So at least with the online students, like it's like right there. It's like you are. Yeah, that's who you are.
It's at least the same way as me. You know your subject area, that's most important. Because
Yes.
I have part-timers and stuff. And the reason that I knew you is because the gals over there said, you know, that you are Jay O'Brien. So I walked in and said, hi, Jay. And that sent it in. So you got to do a quickie.
Yeah. See, he's got part-timers. I have no excuse. I'm just silly. So, all right, moving on. Okay, so let's go. Actually, we're going to get onto the computers now for the big, incredible demos that we're going to have. So let's turn on the computers. This is going to take a couple minutes. And the incredibly top secret password to these computers that you're not allowed to tell anyone or I'll have to kill you is media.
Oh my goodness. I watched your video already.
I'm glad.
Trevor told me that was important.
Oh, I see.
I think it's safe to stop that now. So bye-bye online students if anyone's watching.
Are you going to put what you videoed on the...
Yes, I will put it online.